Good evening, everyone. Tonight's story is a special spooky tale called the Abyssal Temple. Let's begin. The ocean's deep abyss had always fascinated Dr. Elena Morales. With her team of expert marine biologists and seasoned divers, they were on an expedition to map previously uncharted sections of the Mariana Trench. For weeks, they had been descending deeper into the watery darkness than anyone had dared before, relying on advanced submersibles and technology to navigate the crushing pressure. Every dive felt like a journey into the unknown, and each time they surfaced, Elena felt a familiar thrill in her chest, a mixture of fear and excitement that had drawn her to this field in the first place. But today was different. They had picked up something on sonar, an anomaly, an enormous structure almost 2 miles below the ocean's surface. At first, the blips on the screen looked like a cluster of rocks, but the shapes were too uniform. It looked constructed, man-made. The idea that something ancient and forgotten lay that deep sent a wave of adrenaline through the crew. After hours of preparation, Elena and her team suited up and began their descent in the Abyssal Eagle, their submersible. The lights from the vessel barely penetrated the inky blackness, revealing only glimpses of the lifeless terrain far below. Elena sat in the front, eyes glued to the monitors as they slowly approached the structure. Her assistant, David, leaned forward, mouth agape as the sonar image transformed into the real thing, a massive temple, unlike anything they had ever seen. The temple loomed ahead, its dark stone etched with symbols that looked older than time itself. Strange carvings of sea creatures, twisted and monstrous, adorned the exterior. Pillars that seemed to defy the laws of physics stretched upwards, as though trying to pierce the surface. It was breathtaking and unsettling. "Are those statues?" David asked, breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the crew. Elena squinted at the glowing screen. Indeed, flanking the temple's entrance stood rows of towering statues, humanoid figures with elongated arms, hollowed eyes, and twisted, unnatural expressions. They were weathered, eroded by centuries of water, but their eerie presence sent a chill down her spine. "Let's move closer," she said, her voice calm but tight with unease. As they drew nearer, the temple's immense scale became more apparent. The statues were easily 10 feet tall, their grotesque features frozen in time. Each one held something different: a weapon, an animal skull, a trident, but all shared the same lifeless, empty eyes. Yet something about them felt wrong. Too lifelike, perhaps, as if they were waiting. "We should go inside," David suggested, unable to hide his excitement. Elena hesitated but nodded. The front of the temple yawned open like a mouth waiting to swallow them. As they entered, the beam from the submersible's light swept across the vast chamber. Inside were more statues, hundreds of them, arranged in a circle around a central altar. Strange symbols covered the walls, flickering in the light like they were alive. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching them. "Let's take some readings," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. The equipment hummed to life, capturing the data, but something strange happened. Static flickered on the monitors. Then, the lights began to flicker. "What's going on?" David asked, eyes wide as he adjusted the settings on the control panel. The lights flashed, and for a split second, the room plunged into darkness. When they came back on, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the statues had moved. It was subtle. Its head, once facing straight ahead, was now slightly tilted toward them. Elena blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She told herself it was a trick of the light, a reflection caused by the submersible's beams. But then the lights flickered again, and this time, 2 more statues had shifted. They weren't just slightly turned, they had taken full steps forward, their faces now eerily directed at the submersible. "Did you see that?" David whispered, his voice shaky. "I swear, they weren't like that before." But the atmosphere inside the sub had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the weight of the entire ocean was pressing down on them. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back, the statues had moved again, this time much closer, their twisted faces now just feet from the submersible's hull. "Get us out of here," Elena ordered, her voice finally betraying her fear. David was already working the controls, trying to reverse their course, but something was wrong. The sub wasn't moving. The lights flickered again, and this time, when they came back, The statues were almost on top of them. Elena could see the intricate details of their grotesque faces, their hands outstretched as if reaching for the sub. Her mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Statues didn't move. But then, in the dim glow of the flickering lights, she saw it one of the statues blinked. "Oh my God," David whispered. "They're alive." Suddenly there was a loud clang, as if something massive had slammed into the side of the submersible. The entire vessel shook violently, sending the crew members tumbling in their seats. Outside, the statues were moving again, but now it wasn't just a flicker. They were shifting, crawling, lurching toward the sub with a terrifying intent. "Elena, what do we do?" David's voice was desperate. Elena gripped the controls, her hands trembling. She didn't know what to do. She had never encountered anything like this. "We need to find a way out. Now." But before she could react, the lights flickered off completely, plunging them into total darkness. All that remained was the faint glow of the emergency backup lights. In that suffocating blackness, something scraped against the hull, a slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging across metal. The statues weren't just moving, they were surrounding the sub. Elena, David's voice was a low tremor of panic. She didn't answer. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled for the controls. But the sub wouldn't respond. It was as if the entire vessel had been trapped, held in place by some unseen force. Then the scraping stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Elena held her breath, listening, waiting for anything to happen. But the deep stillness of the ocean pressed in around them, suffocating in its intensity. And then the lights flickered back on. The statues were gone. Elena's eyes darted across the monitors, searching the room, but there was no sign of them. The temple chamber was empty. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But just as she reached for the emergency ascent button, the monitors flickered again, this time displaying something else entirely. From the depths of the trench, something massive was rising, a shadow, darker than anything she had ever seen, its size dwarfing the temple itself. It was coming toward them, slowly, deliberately, as if drawn by their presence. Elena, David's voice cracked. What is that?" But she couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. The shadow on the screen was growing larger by the second, its sheer size dwarfing anything Elena had ever encountered in the ocean's depths. It moved with a slow, purposeful grace, as though the crushing pressure of the deep meant nothing to it. And as it approached, a low rumble filled the submersible, a sound too deep to be heard by human ears, but felt in their bones, a primal vibration that sent a wave of nausea through the crew. Elena's hands shook as she pressed the emergency ascent button. Nothing happened. The sub remained frozen, trapped in place by some unseen force. Panic clawed at her throat. "David, we need to override the systems, get us moving," she barked, her voice shaking with fear. "I'm trying," he shouted back, frantically pressing buttons, flipping switches. But the controls were dead. They were stuck, trapped in the belly of the abyss, with something ancient and malevolent closing in. The shadow drew nearer, and as it did, the monitors flickered again, this time showing more detailed, grotesque appendages, writhing like serpents, extending from its form. Each one pulsed with life, glistening and slick, as though they were composed of something not quite solid. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing wasn't just some massive sea creature, it was alive in a way that defied nature, something not meant for human eyes. The rumbling grew louder, more intense, as if the entire ocean was groaning under the weight of this thing. The submersible shook again, a metallic creak echoing through the cabin, as though the very hull was being tested by the pressure. Elena's heart raced as she glanced at the depth gauge. It was malfunctioning, spinning wildly, as if the ocean itself was rebelling against their presence. "Elena, we have to get out of here." Now David's voice was barely contained hysteria. "I know," she snapped, her own terror barely under control. She slammed her fist into the emergency release button, hoping to jettison the ballast and force them to the surface. But the button flickered red, another failure. Elena turned, her eyes wide as she watched the external cameras. The statues were back, and they weren't just standing still anymore. They were climbing up the sides of the submersible, their twisted faces pressed against the portholes, their eyeless sockets boring into the crew. The grotesque figures moved with an unnatural fluidity, As if they were puppets being controlled by something unseen, their stone forms now animated with a nightmarish energy. One of the statues, larger than the others, reached out with a jagged hand, pressing it against the glass of the sub's viewport. Elena could hear the glass groaning under the pressure, tiny cracks spider webbing from the point of contact. "Elena, it's going to break," David shouted, his voice rising in panic. Elena scrambled to the other side of the cabin, trying to think of something, anything that could save them. The lights flickered again, and when they returned, the cracks in the glass had spread wider. The pressure outside was enormous, and if the viewport failed, they would be crushed instantly. But before she could move, the sub's interior was flooded with a deafening roar, a sound so loud and overwhelming that it drowned out all thought. It wasn't coming from outside, but from within. Something was inside the submersible with them. Elena whipped around, her blood turning to ice. The altar at the center of the temple had begun to glow, a sickly, pulsating light that seeped into the cabin through the cracks in the glass. It was as if the temple itself was coming to life, feeding off their fear, their desperation. And then she saw it, the shadowy mass outside had fully arrived, its massive form blotting out what little light remained. Tentacles, thick, sinewy things wrapped around the sub, coiling and squeezing with a strength that defied belief. The metal groaned and buckled under the strain, the walls of the sub warping as if they were made of paper. Through the cracking viewport, Elena could see it now, the creature's face, or what passed for one. A massive, gaping maw, lined with rows of teeth, that shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and in its center, a single, enormous eye. It gazed into the submersible with an intelligence that was terrifying, an ancient malevolence that had slept in the darkness for millennia, now awakened by their intrusion. Elena, David's voice was barely a whisper now. "We're not getting out of this, are we?" For the first time in her life, Elena had no answer. She had faced danger before, but this was something else entirely. Something beyond comprehension, beyond fear. The submersible lurched violently, and the sound of tearing metal filled the cabin as the creature's tentacles ripped into the hull. Water began to pour in, cold and relentless, pooling at their feet as the pressure outside surged in. Elena's mind raced, but there was no escape. No last-ditch effort that could save them from what was coming. The statues pressed closer, their faces grotesque and unfeeling, as if they were sentinels of this nightmare, waiting to deliver them to whatever horror lay at the heart of the temple. And then, in the final moments before the hull gave way, Elena saw it, a fleeting vision, a glimpse into the abyss. Something far worse than the creature outside. A void deeper and darker than the trench itself, calling to them, pulling them into its endless maw. The last thing she heard was the sound of the glass shattering, followed by the crushing weight of the ocean, and then, nothing. With a final, deafening crack, the pressure was too much. The hull of the submersible collapsed inward with a sickening crunch, and there was nothing but cold, crushing blackness. Sometime later, in a world ignorant to the horror therein.
Oh, are we on the air? Good evening, I'm Caroline Howard with breaking news. We start tonight with a tragic update on the renowned science team, led by Dr. Elena Morales, whose groundbreaking deep-sea expedition into the Mariana Trench captivated the scientific community for weeks. In a devastating turn of events, it has now been confirmed that Dr. Morales and her entire crew have been declared lost at sea after their submersible, the Abyssal Eagle, failed to return from its dive earlier this week. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately after contact was lost, but after days of scouring the area, no signs of the crew or their vessel have been found. The last communication received from Dr. Morales indicated that they had discovered an unknown structure deep within the trench. Experts are now speculating whether an unforeseen natural disaster, such as an underwater collapse or a catastrophic equipment failure, may have caused the loss of the submersible. Maritime specialists are warning that the ocean's depths are still largely unexplored, and dangers beneath the surface remain unpredictable. It's a somber reminder that even with modern technology, the abyss holds secrets that may never be fully understood. Dr. Morales and her team were well known for their pioneering work in marine biology and deep-sea exploration. Their loss will be felt deeply by the scientific community, as well as by the families and friends of those brave souls who ventured into the unknown, never to return. We'll continue to follow this tragic story as more details emerge. In the meantime, our thoughts are with their loved ones during this incredibly difficult time. Caroline Howard, signing off for now, wishing you all a safe evening.